Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. In this episode, I'm joined by Matt Hussey, a qualified therapist, journalist, and host of the acclaimed podcast, The Brink, Mental Health Demystified. There are so many myths surrounding psychology and therapy. So in this conversation, what we aim to do is try to clarify some of those from Matt's perspective. And along the way, we'll talk about his own journey to the therapy room, but also about his approach to how he works with people and how he helps them work out the mysteries of what goes on inside our heads. So welcome, Matt.
Great to be here, Phil. Thanks for having me.
What we always try and do on this podcast is for my guests to talk about their own experiences, their own lived experiences of mental health challenges. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about, your experience, what led you to therapy in the first place.
For sure. Yeah. So I was a man in my 20s and, had come from I'd say fairly typical British background. I had two parents who had kids very early, moved from their hometown of Hull to London looking for work and all sorts of things. And so by the time they were 25, 3 kids, a house, a mortgage, a dog, various animals. But there was lots of sort of underlying challenges in their relationship that, being in the 80s, weren't really knowable or maybe had the language to discuss them. And so kind of growing up, my kind of home life was at once stable, but also had a kind of lot of what I'd call like sort of paper cut incidents, right? Small incidents that, aren't life threatening on their own, but over time can be really cumulative. So fast forward to when I was about 27. So I was a journalist at the time. I was working for a magazine and I was living with my partner at the time. We had just bought a flat and essentially what was happening, or what started to happen, is all those sort of things: job, home, partner, family, all really started to crumble at the same time. So my parents sort of embarked on a 5-year, incredibly messy divorce in the courts. And in that time, my mum decided to sort of cut off me and my brother and sister, and we haven't seen or spoken to her ever since. I found out my partner at the time was cheating on me with a guy I sat opposite at my work, which was pretty brutal. And I'd sort of had it in my notice before I'd found that out, because I felt that the pressure of the job wasn't great for our relationship. So I was in my notice period when I discovered this. And then moving out of the flat I just bought with my then partner. So really all my kind of support structures just collapsed within about, I'd say, 6 months. Now, being a fairly typical young man at that time, didn't really have any real language to describe that, didn't really have any support network that I could rely on. And so really tried to sort of strong arm my way through it. By strong arming, I mean not talking about it, probably drinking a lot, and being just very, very, very numb to everything. And I remember having a few experiences where I was able to sort of recognize I should feel something about this thing. And I just didn't. And that worked both in the positive and the negative. I just found myself in this sort of middle where I didn't feel much, wasn't excited about much, wasn't very sad about that much. And it was there that I kind of realized that I should probably try and understand what this is. So I did what most people do when looking for a therapist. I Googled therapist near me, and I was living in North London at the time, in a place called Kentish Town, and there was a kind of a therapy centre around the corner. And it was you got a big list of therapists and their photos and lots of jargon about modalities and approaches and all that stuff, which I had no idea what that really meant. So I just picked a person who I liked the look of. It was a very kind woman who had a very nice, open face, and went for my first session. And I remember very clearly saying, I'm not here to talk about my childhood. I just want to fix the thing happening in front of me. And she laughed, and that was one of many laughing experiences I had with many therapists over the years. But that really kind of started the journey for me in therapy that would last on and off for about 12 years, and I went through 3 different therapists for different reasons, and I can get into each one of those if that's of interest.
Let me just go back to was there a particular tipping point or point where you thought, right, I can't live like this anymore, I need to do something?
Yeah, so I'd obviously left my job. I'd gone freelance. I had moved out of my house. I'd moved into a sort of house share with 2 friends, and I was just alone a lot. And I didn't tell my flatmates at the time that I'd gone to see a therapist. And I hadn't really spoken about what had happened. And I think what the tipping point for me was, like, I just couldn't contain it anymore. And I would have like moments where I suddenly got very angry at sort of things that I couldn't quite understand, like social occasions or something happening at my work. And I think for me, the tipping point was a loss of control, where my emotional world, while very suppressed, and I've been very successful at suppressing that, would find ways out, would find ways of leaking out and just turning up when I didn't want it to be there. And that was really distressing, because I think I'd always or try to create an image of myself as somebody who didn't need anybody, right? Just to be the eternally self-propelling, self-sufficient person. And so when that facade started to crack for me, when I couldn't maintain that facade, that's when I was like, something has to change.
So you can only keep it up for so long, I guess, and it will.
You can, yeah, that's it. And some people can do that for a really long time.
Do your experience then of finding your first therapist, and what would you? So, and then you mentioned you'd had several more since then. What should you look for then when looking for a therapist? Certainly when you had no experience of doing it before.
Absolutely. So this is a kind of a big thing that I talk to a lot of therapists about. So there's a real split between what a therapist thinks and sees and what a client might think and see. So for clients, for people like myself, when I started, your knowledge of the space is beyond what you may have seen on TV, zero, right? So most people, I'd say 95% of people, don't have a real understanding of the difference between a psychologist, a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, a counselor, all these sorts of things. Some of those have protected status as job descriptions, some don't. So that could be a real red herring, right? And so then there's the whole world of modalities, and I think at last count there's like 146 modalities a therapist can reach for. And again, that can be a real red herring, because if you don't know what that modality is, you may then think that's what therapy is, and therefore that if that modality doesn't work for you, you might think therapy doesn't work for you. So for me, and I kind of use the data to support this. So a bunch of researchers went looking at what was the biggest determinant of the success of a client in therapy, right? And they looked at thousands of different clients, and it was 2 things. One, quite obvious, was the client's motivation for change, right? So your desire to want to change, it counts for 50% of success in therapy. And the second one, and the most relevant one for this question, is it's the quality of the relationship you have with your therapist. And that accounts for over a third of outcomes. So when it comes to looking for a therapist, it really relies on how you feel about the person. How do they make you feel? Do they make you feel supported? Do they seem interested? Do they seem busy? Do they seem distracted? Do they seem, all these things that we're in a low knowledge environment at this stage. So all we can really rely on is those relational qualities. And I always say to people, always visit more than one therapist, because you'll find that when they trained, where they trained, what school they trained at, modality will all shape how they work. And that's not for you to try and decipher. Really what you need to understand is, do you like the person that you want to work with? And do you feel they are there to help you and support you?
And how long do you give it? Because you could bit like online dating, I guess. You could just keep swiping right or left, whichever way. I mean, should you give it a few sessions, or is it gut instinct?
Yeah, absolutely. So it be different for everybody. I think some people. So what I offer, for example, is a 15-minute consultation, which is free. This gives you a chance to meet me, and me to meet you. And that might be enough for some people, but that might not be enough. And so there's a really key part of therapy, which is contracting. And so your therapist will send you a contract about how you'll work together and things about like cancellations and things. But you can also add your own clauses in there too, right? And you can say, look, like I'm really new to this. I'm trying to work this all out. I might just want to have a few sessions with you and then not see you again. It's that sort of thing where the idea and the goal of therapy is that you remain in control of the work that you do and the relationship that you have. So just see what feels right. Sometimes you meet someone and it instantly feels right. Sometimes you're not sure, and maybe that might not be a bad thing. And we could talk a lot about some of the challenges that come the way that therapy is being sold at the moment to make it way more like internet dating, which kind of negates a really important part about how you build a relationship with someone. But it really is trust how they make you feel, and then also trust what comes up for you when you work with them or talk to them. Do you feel you're censoring? Do you feel like they may be judging you? All those sorts of things are really relevant and important pieces of information that can be really help develop or really help you understand the quality of what might happen if you work with this person.
And how do you know if it is working? How do you know if first of all, the relationship you've got with your therapist is working? But secondly, in terms of setting and managing your own expectations, and I know that's a very big question, but how can you yourself measure what's happening?
Yeah, and this is probably the biggest challenge therapists have how do you show progress with clients. Now, different modalities will have different ways of measuring, different yardsticks. So, for example, some therapists do what are called kind of like core 10 forms, or there's variants of this, where it's an interview. It's like takes 2 minutes. They do it at the beginning of each session, and it's about how you're feeling. And the idea is that your answers add up to a score. The higher the score, the more distressed you are. The lower the score, hopefully the better you feel. So there are very crude measures like that. The way I work is not to use those sorts of things, because I think for me, what we're trying to recognize is how you approach situations and how they change, or how you approach your own material and if it changes. Change in therapy is one of these really sort of slippery things where you feel like you're not changing at all, and you keep hitting the same topics over and over again, and you keep coming back to talk about somebody, and there's this real sense of they still trouble you or they still bother you. And then that will happen for a while, and then all of a sudden it won't. And there's been a lot of research into trying to understand what that is, what the change is. And the best I've found is really what's happening is when you live in your own skin, you have a series of voices that talk to you. They can be critical, supportive, and a mixture of things. Therapy, what that does is introduce another voice, typically the therapist's voice. And a really good sign of change that I see in my clients, and I don't prompt them to do this, they do this on their own, is when they say to me, I was in a situation and I heard you talking to me. And that's a really good measure of really what we look at in therapy, which is the internalization of new voices and therefore new ideas, right? So the bit of sort of geeky theory, there's an idea that your internal voice doesn't start as your internal voice. It starts as another voice, typically a parent's voice. And then you internalize it, and then you make it your own. So the voice stops being your mother or father and becomes you. This happens all the way through your life. And what therapy is really trying to do is introduce a new voice, embed it in very quickly so that it becomes your voice. So the idea is that you internalize your therapist, and therefore you have a therapist that comes with you that ultimately is you. So that's kind of a key way that I look for change. And just how they see themselves, how they interact. Like, if they come to talk about personal, or they come to talk about loss, or they come to talk about anxiety or depression, you're just looking for those slight shifts in perspective. And hopefully a therapist will spot them and then show you them so that you get to see them, because you might not notice, right? So, yeah. So that's a kind of very roundabout way of trying to explain what change looks like in the work.
And how, I think there's often a bit of confusion around, is the therapist going to tell you what you need to do in order that you feel different? I mean, how are you guided, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. So some will be very prescriptive. So if we sort of lay therapy out on a spectrum, and we have what are called highly didactic therapeutic styles. So CBT would be one of them. DPD is another one. They are very much based around giving you homework and structure, and they'll be measuring your responses to questions. And the goal there would be for the therapist to take you through a process that lowers those levels or helps you feel better. That works for some people. Some people really want that prescriptive approach. Some people have treatment plans where the idea is you go through a 6, 8, or 10-week period. The idea is to sort of just improve your overall well-being around that thing. And then there is perhaps where I sit more on the other end, the kind of more open-ended, unstructured, existential, weird and wonderful place that often makes people feel very anxious, where the assumption that I work on is that you'll bring the work you need when you need to bring it. And that can be you talking about the weather for 6 weeks and then suddenly you change. That could be you saying, I want to talk about a thing, and then I can sort of say, would you want me to bring that back each session to see where you are with it? Right. So it's way more an act of co-creation in the work. So it's to be alongside a client rather than me being a kind of authority figure and then say, you must do this now, or you must confront this, or you must explore this week. Some therapists do that and have good results. Some therapists don't. But really, if I was to make one kind of point for anyone listening to this, thinking about therapy, is it really is a co-creating thing. And you have just as much say in the work, how you work, what you work on, as your therapist. So if at any point you feel that you've lost that ability to shape and influence it, bring it up, because this is really about how you feel about you rather than how someone else feels about your material.
And what if it's difficult? What if you find it very difficult to talk about some of these things? I mean, some of them you may have carried for years, they're buried deep. You may not have the words to express them. How do you go about helping, I guess, your therapist by sharing what the problem might be, even if you don't know what it is?
Yeah, so this is a really great point. So when I went to therapy, I had a rough idea what I wanted to talk about. So it was the numbness was the thing that brought me there. But it wasn't what I worked on ultimately. What I worked on was really the relationships that I had attained and lost or wanted, or all these sorts of things. And so the assumption is, or a good assumption for therapists to have, is the client may or may not know what they want to work on or how to work on it. And if you start from that place where it's enough for the client to say, I need help, but I may not know what that help is yet. And so for a client to be able to say that and that be enough to start, then that's when a therapist should be able to kind of come in and go, okay, so let's see if we can explore just what this thing looks like. Or does it have a shape? Does it have a color? Does it have a texture? Is it historical? Is it brand new? Is it, when does it turn up? When does it not turn up? Like, there are lots of ways of talking about the thing without talking about the thing. And really what we're trying to do in that exercise is raise awareness of when it turns up, when it goes away, when it's loud, when it's quiet. Even if we don't necessarily know what it is, if we get better at spotting it when it turns up, we can get better at understanding what it does to us. And then we can start to work and manage on that response and help us develop a better response to it that helps it go away more quickly. And also over time, once we've felt, and trust is a huge part of this process, that if you don't feel safe, if you don't trust your therapist, you're not going to go to those dark, shady corners of you, right? So it's a real process. But if you don't know what it is, and you're not one of these people who uses therapeutic language, that's fine. It's enough to say, I have this thing, I find it very difficult, and that should be enough to work on.
And how important is it to, let everything spill out? Is because there are assumptions that if you don't share everything, if you don't go to those deep, dark corners, then you're never really going to, get to the bottom of what really, needs work.
Yeah, I have quite strong opinions on that. So some therapists try to accelerate clients into spilling the guts, right? Revealing all. I disagree with that approach. And the reason why I disagree with that approach is because the things that you keep locked up, the things in boxes marked toxic, do not open, or bad relationship or whatever, they're locked up for a reason, right? And the primary reason why we lock things away is protection. The thing inside that box is so damaging, so dangerous, so disruptive that we never learned how to live with it. So we just box it up and put it away. Understanding that is a normal and natural thing to do, and therefore should be respected, is really, really important. Because sometimes you can come and do work with a therapist and you get benefit from it and you don't go near the boxes. Like, I've had clients who, when you work with a client, you do an assessment where you try and understand the bigger picture of their story. And you'll find unbelievably difficult experiences in that wider assessment. But in the work, they never talk about it. It's not something that comes up. You can invite them to talk about it, but if they don't talk about it, they don't want to talk about it. And I think it's really important to recognize that if someone doesn't want to talk about something, that's fine. Because they may feel it's more important to feel they can keep it locked away until the moment where it feels safe to get it out. So for me, that time, how long that takes, or how much motivation someone might have to do that, really depends.
And I think there's another assumption. Continue on from what you're saying, perhaps, that a lot of trauma in childhood is what drives mental ill health. And now I know that's obviously very specific to individual people, but how, as a generalization, how true is that?
Yeah, so it's a huge part of the work, but it's not as straightforward as that. So a different way of thinking about it is, as a child, you will develop a blueprint for relationships. That blueprint will be based mostly, almost entirely, on whoever your primary caregivers were. Some people that's parents, others is grandparents, whatever. The way that you interacted with them, the way that you formed attachments with them, the way that you understood the boundaries or felt a lack of boundaries will be really informative for all your relationships going forward. Now, most people, luckily, don't have what I would call like capital T trauma in their lives. And that's a good thing. But what lots of people will have is what are called sort of small traumatic events, which are very different. So, there's a clinical definition of trauma here, which is the kind of persistent reoccurring of the event in your head, right? So That's a very kind of prescriptive definition. But most people will have a memory of moments where things were good, things were not so good. And for most people, they won't seem to be that problematic or difficult or challenging. The reason why they become challenging is typically when that sort of learning or adaptation starts to interfere with the functioning of other relationships. So you may find that your relationship with your dad, for example, was very distant, let's say. He wasn't really available that often. He wasn't very reachable. He wasn't very emotional, wasn't very affectionate. And what that might do is that might turn up in your later life, in your romantic relationships, where you assume that figure that he did in your life. You're distant, you're not available. Now, was your dad mentally ill? We don't know, right? Have you found it's interfered with your relationships and made life more difficult for you? Yes. So therefore, it's for you to then work through it. And this is the thing, that comes up so often, where most people come to talk about their parents in some form or another. What will happen in that is you'll end up being very angry with your parents for how they treated you. And you want your parents to go and do some work on themselves. And I did this with my parents, and you go and confront them and they just say, yeah, I don't think it's a problem. And that can be really difficult because the way they brought you up has had an impact on you in your life. Some in positive ways, some in negative ways. Really, the perception of how negative it is and therefore how necessary it is to change is up to you to decide. So does childhood trauma play a role? Yes, but only if you decide it's problematic. Because I've worked with people who don't think it's problematic and think their relationships and how they're constructed are fine, even though everyone around them says it's not. So, yeah, and I think with a lot of these answers, Philip, I'm going to be very annoying and say it depends on lots of things. But hopefully that's given a bit more of an overview of how it might work.
Yes, it does. What happens though? I mean, is there an expectation? Do people have an expectation that they're going to be fixed and, suddenly all those things will go away and there'll be this Instagram kind of perfect person?
Yes. And Instagram has played a huge role in shaping and influencing that, right? And something I saw very scary the other day was, I think it's something like 95% of material about mental health does not come from someone who's qualified to say it. So you can see there's a lot of misinformation out there. But there is an expectation that you can be fixed, because I think this is a hangover of where therapy came from, which is it came out of the medical model, right? It came out of sort of hospitals and doctors who specialized in mental health. And, when you go to a doctor or a hospital, there is that very clear sense of, I have a broken leg. Can you fix me? Yes, I can. Here's the process. You do it and you are fixed. With therapy, annoyingly, it's not like that. And the best way I can describe it to people is you can't undo the experience that you've had. And therefore you cannot surgically remove the experience that you've had. All you can do is learn to build your life and by integrating it into your life, rather than trying to keep it separate and keeping it outside. Really, what therapy is learning how to integrate it and learning how to accept that it happens. That doesn't mean accept that someone did something terrible to you and it's fine. Quite the opposite. But it's really about, how do you find a way of living in your own skin, knowing what you know about what your life has been like.
So it's something you have to practice ongoing in your life?
You do. And I wrote about this yesterday. I had a client end with me recently, and I said, while we're ending here, the work never ends. And they got very upset about that. And I had to clarify that a little bit. And what I meant by that is, you'll come to therapy and you might work on a thing, right? A relationship or a loss or something. And you may find it really useful, really helpful to helping you process that thing. But your life will continue to throw up things for you. You'll continue to change, and you'll continue to change too. And so really the work of being you never ends. And that work of how you deal with things, how you enter into relationships, how you leave relationships, how you see yourself in the world will be an ever evolving experience and process. And that's not necessarily mean that you have to do it with a therapist, far from it. Therapy is a foundation, not a forever thing. So it's the idea of once you've had a bit of therapy and you've seen how you can change, it's to hopefully inspire some curiosity in you to go, I'd like to do that in other parts of my life, and I'd like to continue doing that in other parts of my life and continue to find better ways of living with other people and ourselves.
So is that, if you think about how you might know if you're done, if you need therapy anymore, and again, each person is an individual, but are there, from what you've just said there, is that a point where you might have, got what you needed out of the experience?
For sure. Yeah, that's it. And Sigmund Freud coined a phrase many moons ago. It was called a flight to health. And it was the idea of you leave when you're ready, and that should always be the client's decision. And when do you feel ready? Well, there's a few pointers we observe in our clients. What you might find is you sort of plateau. You find nothing new to talk about, or no new information is revealed, or you find you may struggle to bring material each week, and you may find you end up talking much more generally without anything specifically troubling you. And those are really good moments to sort of introduce the idea of like, hey, I think I've got enough for now. And my therapy journey, I did it for 12 years, different therapists on and off, going through different experiences. I felt I needed to go back, and I still have that option. Like with my therapist, I've said to her that like I'll probably be back at some point. So it's really about working out when's a good time for you, when you feel the intensity that maybe brought you there has gone down, or whether you feel a sense of safety in how your life looks at the moment, or you feel you're more able to project into the future and imagine a version of yourself that's more positive. These can all be really good signs of when A, therapy is working, and B, we may start to think about what life might look like beyond therapy.
Is it something that everyone should try, at least once in their life?
There's a big debate about this going on at the moment, because on the one hand, everyone's saying, yes, you should go and explore something with someone. And on the other hand, there is a kind of very real point about, is this just a kind of sales tactic for therapists? I think everyone should have a relationship in their life where they feel supported, understood, and able to rely upon. That doesn't have to be therapy or a therapist. That could be anybody. That could be a neighbor. That could be a parent, a former colleague. It's anybody who you feel you can rely on, and who you feel looks out for you or takes an interest in you. Like I think there can be a danger to say that care can only come from a therapist, and that's not true. All therapy really is a concentration of ideas that exist in every relationship. That all we do is practice a very specific form of relationship with a person. That you should be able to find that anywhere without paying for it. So for me, I'd say if you have people in your life that help you, that support you, great. You don't need therapy. But those moments where you don't feel like you have that, it might be really good to see what life feels like when somebody is consistently supporting you.
And what about talking a bit about fears that people may have that might stop them doing this? I mean, some people might feel nervous or ashamed of talking to somebody. What advice would you give them?
One, it's normal. It's really, really normal. I had that dozens of times in my therapist. There are moments where I really ummed and ahed about talking about certain things. And two, like that is probably the most common thing we see in therapy is I want to be helped, but I find it really difficult to talk about the thing that I need help over. So one, that's normal. And two, it can just be enough to say, I realize I have a lot of shame around certain things. I find it very difficult to talk about. Because really what you're looking for is somebody who doesn't judge you for that. Somebody who won't push you away, right? Shame is, I often try to explain this. So the key difference here is between shame and guilt is a core concept, right? When we feel guilty, guilt is really a kind of localized incident where we have done something bad, right? We might have broken something, we might have forgotten something. What shame is a belief that we are bad. It's a kind of total feeling of worthlessness. And so when we feel that, that's because we really haven't got any data or evidence to suggest that someone would want to know that thing about us. And so when we have that, and everybody has it, by the way, especially people who say they don't, they definitely do. It's about going, can I even just recognize that I have it? And can I just be able to see and test whether, if I say I have lots of shame around X, or I feel embarrassed, or I feel I can't talk about something, what comes back when I say that for therapists? And that's the really key thing, because if we can start to build up this little file that says, actually, it's okay to have these things in your head, it makes it easier with time to say more about them, to talk about them more, and then to sort of be able to, with time, renegotiate what that thing means to you and how it sits in your life.
But this comes back then, I guess, to building this relationship, having trust, which I guess can take some time, but being with making sure you've got the right fit, I guess.
Yeah. And also, trust is a thing that, it's a weird thing, right? It's a cornerstone of civilization, right? You have to trust in strangers all the time that you'll never meet or see to have done something properly, right? Just as the house you're sitting in right now, you have to trust that the people that built it properly. You have to trust that when you walk down the street, someone does not mount the curb and just try and run you over. You have to trust that the food you go and buy from the supermarket has not been poisoned, right? It is everywhere, but it's never really spoken about. And in a therapy room, it's incredibly important, right? And also it's incredibly important if you don't trust them. I didn't trust my therapist for 4 years. Didn't know that. Didn't know that's what I was doing. But that was what was really holding me back in the work, because I was so aware of my need to manage what I felt was her perception of me. So I sort of took on the archetype of the kind of good client. I would always be on time. I would always finish on time. I would never get too upset. I would always report that things were going well, all this kind of stuff, right? And that was really because I didn't really trust that my therapist could manage me if I wasn't there. If I wasn't well behaved, if I was late, or if I did go over time, or if I was really upset. And so that part of the work, again, it's one of these things that don't go said often enough, but we really should talk about it more, because trust leads to safety, leads to vulnerability, leads to connection, all these things that everybody really wants and craves. But we have to start by recognizing, is there trust there? And if there isn't, being able to talk about why there isn't there.
That's really interesting, this concept, though, of people pleasing, of trying to be a good client. And with that, I guess you could have people that feel they shouldn't be there. They feel they've got maybe imposter syndrome.
Yeah, survivor's guilt. Often, is what we call it. It's the idea that you look upon the world and you see incredible suffering, and you seem to have not endured it in the same way. Yet you're here telling someone about your story, right? And you get that a lot, right? A lot of people will try and trivialize their own material, right? Even in therapy, because a couple of reasons. One is because it's the ever-present awareness of comparison, right? Humans are always trying to assess where they sit in a kind of hierarchy or group, and suffering is no different. And the second one is really about what happens internally with our own material, which is, and I see this a lot with clients, the way they will have internalized it or memorized it will often be to minimize it, to make it as small as possible. So I'll give you an example. So a long time ago, I worked with a client, and they were telling me about an experience they had with a boyfriend a long time ago. And the way they described it is, I was drunk one night, and we were out at a party, and then came home, and then I was sort of like half asleep, and he was sort of trying to have sex with me. And I said, well, so at any point did you say no? Yes, I said that a lot. And I said, well, that you could argue that wasn't just a incident. That was something much far higher, far worse, right? You could argue that was rape, right? I'm not a legal expert, but just the way that we contextualize our experiences can often be to make them as small as possible, to make them as manageable as possible. And what happened is when I said that word, right, it changed how that memory sat with her. And it led to a very long and very painful period of having to recalibrate that memory to be something far worse, right? Because she didn't want it to be far worse. She wanted to be able to dismiss it as something, just a drunk night. But then we found out it happened more than once. And then we found out it happened when she was asleep. And you start to see this kind of cascading thing. And then we see how it influenced her behavior and how she was in other relationships. And so that thing of trivializing and minimizing, is really, really common, and it happens a lot, and it happens for good reasons. But often when a client comes and says, I don't think I should be here, it's because they're worried that they might be judged for wanting help for something they feel in the grand scheme of things is quite small.
And what about cost? Because, there's an assumption that it's the privilege of people that have got disposable income to spend, £50 to £100, whatever it is, a week or every 2 weeks. What if you haven't got that? Or how do you justify spending the money?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a huge problem we have, right? So at the moment, I think if you go to the NHS and you say, I need to see a therapist, depending on what trust you sit inside, in terms of region, you could wait up to 2 years to see someone. That is not an effective level of care for somebody with acute emotional distress, right? So on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, you have therapists who've got to live, and it costs tens of thousands of pounds to qualify, train. For lots of people, they have bills to pay, and so that's a real problem. Now there are lots of low cost therapy services. I don't think these services do enough to say that they are there. So every therapist has to train at a low-cost therapy service, and they're not paid because what they get in exchange for experience is supervision, and the charity can often then provide low-cost therapy. So where I worked, a place called Headstrong, which is nationwide, sessions can be as low as £5, as high as £30, right? So there are options for low-cost therapy. And also, if you go and see a therapist and they don't offer concessions, then they may not be the therapist for you, right? Because I had this in my journey where I had months where I couldn't pay, and it built up in arrears, and then that just started interfering with the work. And I said, look, I can't keep working with you because every time I see you, I know that pile of money I owe you gets larger and larger and larger. So that is a huge part of the work. And so I would always encourage people to seek out low-cost therapy because it's a really high standard of therapy for very little money in relative terms, especially if the NHS avenue seems abnormally long, or, the type of therapy that I do is not available on the NHS because the NHS are very constrained by resource and cost. You may only get 6 sessions, you may only get CBT, but you may benefit far more from a very different style of therapy. So that's what I'd advise.
So Matt, something I didn't ask you earlier on is, you undertook therapy yourself, but what then, why did you then become a therapist yourself?
Yeah, so it was really just the change I saw in myself and going, I think everyone should feel what that feels like. And you will often know somebody who has enjoyed therapy because they can't stop talking about it. So yeah, that for me was a change I saw in myself, and also the career I had. I was a journalist at the time, and I watched journalism really change from a people business to a really it's you and a laptop business, right? So it's you working alone because many publications no longer supported offices because of cost cutting. You would often interview people that you never really meet because, again, the time constraints of going out to travel to meet someone would interfere with your ability to produce more work. And so I saw a real decline in the interactions with the people that I had at the beginning of my career in the early 2000s. And I wanted to work directly with people. Like, I think it is the most immediate thing you could get when working with another person. And it's just the two of you in a room, and there's no other. Well, sometimes I do it on Zoom as well, so there's a bit of technology there, but it's just the two of you. So for me, it was really about I just really loved working with people and being around people, and then trying to sort of help them feel how I did when I started to see those things changes or those not unravel or relationships improve. Yeah.
So, as a last question, then, Matt, what? If somebody's listening to this and they've not gone down the therapy route, they've either not really known what to expect or they're not really sure if it's for them, what first steps could they take, today just to explore that route?
For sure. So there's loads of services, right, at the moment. And, you can either go down, you can go to sort of a company that has 10 to 15 therapists in one place, or you can go and find someone privately. There's lots of directories out there with lots of qualified therapists who are all there and willing to help. And so if you were at the very first step, my advice would be just go and talk to people, right? Every good therapist should offer a free taster session or a free call or an opportunity to meet them in person, right? So that you can see what it feels like. You can see what it feels like to be sat in a room that you might not be sat in before, to sit on Zoom, in a way you haven't sat on before. So it's really to kind of give yourself the space and also to trust that those parts of you that will be giving you feedback about whether this is good, whether this is bad, whether this makes you feel uncomfortable, or I feel strange, or I don't like the person. They're all really valid data points, and to sort of listen and to give space to that part of you that may not be a part you give a lot of time to. But in this instance, especially at the beginning, it's all that you have to go on. So talk to some people, see how they make you feel, and don't worry about the modality. Don't worry about, qualifications and stuff. Just find someone you enjoy being with and start from there.
Thank you, Matt. That's been brilliant. We'll put a link in how to contact you if people want to, or perhaps what would be the best way if somebody wants to contact you?
So I exist on the internet in many forms. So I have my personal therapy website, but I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram. I have a love-hate relationship with TikTok. But any way you can, in any of those methods, you can contact me. I write a lot, especially on LinkedIn at the moment. So if you're on there and you look up my name, I'll turn up and you see me whispering away about all kinds of stuff. And I always try to speak to everybody. So, yeah, don't be a stranger.
I can vouch for those, for your podcast, first of all, The Brink. And I love reading your articles on LinkedIn. So, Matt, thank you very much. That's been brilliant.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. To help raise the profile of the podcast, I'd be truly grateful if you could leave a review on your preferred listening platform or directly on the website, which is mid-lifemen.com. You can find links to Matt's work by visiting his Linktree profile. So linktr.ee/Matt Hussey, Hussey. Or find him on LinkedIn, Matt Hussey1. And you can also listen to his brilliant podcast, The Brink Mental Health Demystified, on all the usual podcast platforms. Finally, there's now a book called Men Speak Up, Journeys Through Mental Health, which is based on the podcast, and it's available to buy on Amazon and through other online retailers.